Many Americans don't realize that Muslims in the United States are one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse religious communities in the United States. And this happens because many of us have this particular picture in mind that most often looks like the TV characters in TV shows, in movies, and on the news. And these images are overwhelmingly negative, with one study that looked at New York Times articles over 25 years and found that Islam and Muslims were portrayed more negatively than cancer and cocaine. So they were portrayed more negatively than cancer and cocaine. And there was even a recent study that just came out citing similar research and came to the similar conclusions. These studies, the movies, TV shows, only depict a limited and harmful narrative about Islam and Muslims and reinforce negative stereotypes and contribute to the erasure of the vibrant and diverse religious and cultural community that is anything but a monolith. This erasure is rooted in racism and religious discrimination in the United States that holds onto an image of the model, ideal, normal American as someone who is white and Christian. This attempt to erase our religious and racial diversity isn't new. Many historians now believe that nearly a third of enslaved Africans were Muslims. And not only was their physical freedom stripped from them, their religious freedom to practice their deeply held religious and cultural traditions were ruthlessly prevented. This included their indigenous and Muslim religious practices, erasing people's religious practices, stripping their physical freedoms, and any chance to flourish was already well underway by European colonizers who destroyed American indigenous communities, including the Omaha tribes of Nebraska and Iowa. And so each of these amazing speakers knows this issue deeply, the history and the current experiences within Muslim communities and those perceived to be Muslim, like Sikh, South Asian, and Hindu communities. Each of them have been working to help people name the harms while leading us towards healing and hope, which is the overarching theme for this conference. The first question I'd like to ask Margari to start us off: how would you explain or begin to explain about how anti-Black racism and religious intolerance work together to impact the experiences of Muslims to someone who is not at all engaged in this topic, to someone's new?
Yeah, so I think I would take definitely two, there may be two approaches, right? So if we want to really get to some of to the roots, and from the historian in me has like a particular approach that is pre-modern of looking at how do we understand anti-Muslim oppression, or even understanding white supremacy, right? There's a lot of discussions around what are the formations, what are the foundations, and that's the starting point that I would come from as an anti-racism educator. And so Andrea Smith has actually written a really great article that talks about the three prongs of white supremacy, and those are, Native genocide, right? So the colonization of indigenous lands in America and Asia, and in the US, we're talking about, the genocide while there's still Native Americans who are still resilient and still working for autonomy. The second one is anti-Black racism, right? So that started with, you could see that really in the formation with the transatlantic slave trade. And then the third one that she talks about is Orientalism, right? So which is how traditionally, like academics, we would talk about it as Orientalism, and especially in the terms of during that period of colonization and transatlantic slave trade. What I have found in my own work in the Iberian Peninsula and that history is like this kind of early formation of whiteness. Like, how did Europeans come to understand themselves in opposition to the world? And this is before we could even imagine that we would have European domination, right? But a part of it in that formation is very anti-Asian and anti-African, anti-Black, anti-Asian, and those forms were anti-Moor in Spain, right? And when you think about whether like you do a Shakespeare play, how do they understand the Muslims, right? They use blackface, they have black images. And so at the roots of understanding the Moor was rooted in blackness in many ways. And similarly, the Turk, which was also seen as Asian, right? And other. And so European identity and formation is in opposition to that, which was really in opposition to Muslimness, which they saw as competitors. And in that time, when you look at the doctrine of discovery, like all of these like documents that the Pope had issued. And so there was one papal bull that goes to King Alfonso. And we usually in our training, we have our participants read this text. And what you find is those three foundations, which allows King Alfonso to do certain things to those that they see as pagans, enemies of Christ, and Saracens, which is another name for Muslims. It's like a tribal name. And enemies of Christ, they're talking about Jews. So even that identity is like anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim. And when they're talking about pagans at this time, they were talking about mainly African pagans. And these doctrines, right, even what you would see in the Matamoros, which is like the patron saint of Spain, which is like the killer of Moors, they were either racialized as like swarthy or black, and that became appropriated to justify the killing of Indians. And so you have like Mata Indios in the Americas. So what we argue is to find that connection in the doctrine of discovery, which is still a legal document that was taken into account by RBG, is that this was like a dispute with indigenous tribes in Hawaii as far as like, where they were fighting over land. And RBG actually cited the doctrine of discovery to still keep the US as a colonial force, like that they still had like authority and power over this land. So it's not like this stuff is way back in the past, that it's still relevant now. But that doctrine of discovery, we see that core roots. And so when we make the case, we're not just saying that, hey, anti-Muslim bias, anti-Muslim oppression is a tag on to anti-Black racism or as an outcrop. Foundationally, the impetus for the transatlantic slave trade began during this period. And so we're deeply intertwined. And if we're really working to create a world where we can all belong, right, where we're all safe, we have to disentangle those. We have to dismantle those three logics. So that's like a powerful, like kind of historical thing. But as we think about the demographics, as far as like Muslim identity in the United States, the majority of Muslims in the United States are racialized either as African or Asian. However, wherever you want to put the Arabian Peninsula, sometimes like what you would see in laws where they were in the early 20th century, when they would allow immigration, it depended on like if they wouldn't allow immigration because they're like, oh no, they're Orientals or they're Africans. So the Egyptians were too Black or the Syrians were too Asian. And so, but it was really that you saw like with even Arabs of fighting for whiteness, even though that, many like, and these Arabs that were fighting for whiteness, they argued because they were Christian. So when later Muslim Arabs came, they didn't identify as white, but they were labeled and lumped into this category. And so I think it's very important for us to really think about how Muslims are racialized. And even when we think about in the European case where there are European Muslims, of thinking about Bosnia or in Albania and how they're racialized. And you could even see now in popular culture that the Albanians in Taken were all made swarthy and dark. But most of the Albanians I know are like blonde, like you could not tell them the difference between them and other Slavic people. So I think it's important for us to think about that, and then to consider that a good 1/3 of American Muslims are Black, and that they're facing overlapping oppressions. They're facing anti-Black racism. They're facing religious discrimination that's coming in the form of laws, policies, political discourses. increased criminalization that all Muslims have been facing, especially with the amped up security state post 9/11. When that actually began, I would say many of these laws actually started to come into play, the incursion of civil liberties after the Oklahoma bombing. But the first cases of Islamophobia that we could see, we could go back to the slavery, like during the slavery periods of like just the intense scrutiny of religious practices of Africans and separating Africans from other Africans to make sure that they weren't practicing their religion, communicating. There was deep fear around Africans who were Muslim, and that came from the Bahia revolts, people that were seeking their freedom and autonomy in the Americas. And so, and the hyper scrutiny on those who were able to write. And, you know, there's a lot of Orientalism, even when you read about like Omar ibn Said, like, you know, that were African Muslims who could read and write, which, you know, Africans were supposed to have no history and no culture and not be able to write. But yet here were these Africans able to do so. So in the 20th century, the first cases of surveillance began with the Moorish the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam. And the hysteria around that, even with Malcolm X, with the hate that hate produced. And so the surveillance of the FBI going from the 1930s up into COINTELPRO, continuing through the 80s and 90s, and it escalated post 9/11. So I think it's very important that we really root our understanding in Islam as a racialized religion, as seen as Asian and African. Many of the laws that go and that target Muslims are either rooted in anti-Blackness or anti-Asian, in the anti-Asian immigrant acts that were passed in California, and even the surveillance and the internment of Japanese Americans. So I would say that not just anti-Blackness, but we have to really understand anti-Muslim bigotry as anti-Black and anti-Asian racism. And there's many, you know, complexities and nuances around that. And it's important for us to understand the intersecting identities and understand that for us to address racial justice, that we can't just exclude Muslim identities.
Thanks, Margari. Yeah, I was working on our training program, our Faith Over Fear training program, and relooking at some of our informational pieces and history pieces. And I looked at how there was in 1857, there was a white man that was being tried for killing an Asian man, a Chinese man. And the judge decided that the Chinese eyewitness accounts were not admissible because at that time in courts, people who were not white could not testify against people who were white. And that was used against Blacks and against Asians and against Native Americans and others. And right after that case, there was a sharp uptick in anti-Asian violence that swept the country, in addition to the lead up to the Civil War and the after that and all this. So it's not ancient history even. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Petra, the ISPU has built a trusted reputation for your research into experiences of American Muslims. And through this research, you've identified trends and examples of how anti-Muslim discrimination shows up. Can you share about how the race, national origin, and gender of a person, among other factors, impacts their experiences of anti-Muslim discrimination? And can you also share about like why, when we discuss anti-Muslim discrimination, we say, and those perceived to be Muslim? Margari was just talking about racialized Islamophobia.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with that actually. I think by now it should be a well-known fact that the first victim post 9/11 attack of anti-Muslim sentiment was actually not a Muslim. It was a Sikh man who was perceived to be a Muslim because of how he looked. Again, you in your introduction, you mentioned that there is a stereotypical look to what people assume Muslims are supposed to look like, which is what is portrayed by the news and in the entertainment industry. So the assumption is all Muslims look like what we see on TV. which there are some, I have family members who look like that, but the majority of people don't look like what we see on TV. And so because of what that person looked like, he was perceived to be Muslim, and he was actually killed after 9/11. So that's just one example among, hundreds of examples between those attacks in today, with every major event that happen in our country where Muslims are blamed for, or are part of the story. Those who are perceived to be Muslims are also at risk. So that's to start with that one. A follow-up to it is, how does race, gender, and nationality play? The easiest answer is to look at how gender plays into this. So you mentioned earlier the diversity of the American Muslim community. We have almost every race, ethnic, or an ethnic group here in this country. And a lot of people don't, for example, one of the way that, Islam have been racialized is, on one hand, we have a very large African-American community. That's almost the largest community among American Muslims. But when you ask Americans of any background, including, Arabs and Asians and others, what comes to mind when you think of American Islam? They don't say African Americans, they don't say Black. So that's one way it has been racialized, and the history of the religion in this country have been erased, because if we automatically think African-American Black when we think of Islam in the US, then we have to admit the historical context of it. On the other, so one of the way we looked at how race plays into this, we worked with the Bridgetown Initiative out of Georgetown University to develop something called the Islamophobia Index. So it's part of our American Muslim poll, which is a national general survey that we used to do every year. Now it's biannual. The 2022 is coming out in August 25th, so check it out. But we developed the Islamophobia Index, and we asked the general public, how much do you agree with specific statements that are based on stereotypes about American Muslims, okay? And those stereotypes are connected to policies, discriminatory policies against American Muslims. And so some of the statements include, most American Muslims are misogynistic, or they discriminate against women, which, by the way, that's the most salient of the stereotypes against American Muslims. Most American Muslims are not civilized. Most American Muslims are prone to violence. Most American Muslims should be held responsible for acts of member of their faith, and so on and so forth. So looking at the one about gender, where a lot of people assume that, most American Muslims are discriminating against Muslim women, we looked at how the experience of American Muslim women compared to the experience of women in the general public. And so we looked at that, and, not surprisingly, American Muslim women and American in the general public experience gender-based discrimination about the same rate, so misogyny is a thing in our society and also around the world. But we looked at Muslim American women, and they experience religious-based discrimination at a higher level than those in the general public. Okay, so clearly their religious identity is impacting them negatively. And then we looked at racial, like, does it matter what kind of Muslim you are, And the Muslim women experience a higher level of discrimination based on their race than they do based on their religion, than they do based on their gender. So in that context, we look at an African-American Muslim woman experience compared to, let's say, a white Protestant women, and what they're experiencing in the society. And clearly both race and religion do not play into the favor of the Muslim, Black Muslim women here. So that's one way. We worked actually with Shoulder to Shoulder and developing a toolkit on actually American Invisible, to develop a toolkit on countering Islamophobia I'll share the link for those who are interested. But in it, we identified 3 types of or how Islamophobia show in people's life. It shows at an institutional level. This is when we're talking about airports, jobs, interaction with police law enforcement, healthcare, so on and so forth. And then it shows up at an at a private level. So, from you to me, from a private citizen to another, and then it's structural. So all of that it shows in the way we oppose building mosques. It shows in the way that mosques are vandalized. It shows in the level of discrimination that American Muslims experience when applying for jobs. The 44% of American Muslims who experience discrimination at the airport compared to an extremely lower percentage among the general public. The 25% American Muslims who experience it while receiving healthcare. Think of that during a pandemic. My own family, I've actually taken my parents to a doctor that was literally 2 hours away from our house when we have a hospital that was less than 5 minutes away, based on the experience, the discriminatory, experience that we have seen with them. So I could share a million, example of how my own family have experienced that in every aspect of our life. But those are some of the examples of how it showed up. And then lastly, just to close up, one of the things that we do is talking about trends. We measure Islamophobia index every year. And what we're seeing is, the good news is we're not talking about the majority of American society being Islamophobic. But what we are talking about is that Islamophobia is inching up every year. It is increasing every year. And the good thing is you could actually do something about it. So looking at Jewish Americans, they were able to reduce their score on the Islamophobia index over the last couple of years. So you could do something about Islamophobia and reduce it, but it is growing in our society. And it is a political ideology. It is a political ideology that the level of Islamophobia increases around political seasons and with political rhetoric, not based on religiosity or your religious affiliation. So I'll end it here.
Thanks so much. And if you get a chance, she's going to put the link to ISPU's research there. They have amazing graphics and research that helps a lot of us better understand the nuances. Todd, you have spoken at many of our shoulder to shoulder trainings. In fact, I think maybe you were in Omaha with us 4 years ago, 3 years ago. We often recommend your 2 books, The Fear of Islam and Presumed Guilty, to our networks for future reading. An essential thesis that you often highlight is that when we address anti-Muslim discrimination, it's not necessarily about ignorance or lack of knowledge about Islam, that it's about racism. How did you come to this realization yourself, and how does it change your response, our response to anti-Muslim discrimination?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's good to be back again. Well, let me start by saying I believe this is one of the most common misunderstandings about Islamophobia, particularly amongst people who are trying to counter it, is that it's driven primarily by ignorance. If we focus our efforts on educating the broader public on the tenets of Islam, if we help the non-Muslim majority understand what jihad really means or what Sharia really means, then the assumption is we will be able to significantly reduce, if not eliminate, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim discrimination. And that kind of thinking has been around for a long time. It certainly was the core way of thinking after 9/11. And so a lot of the efforts to counter Islamophobia focused on what I call these Islam 101 presentations. And I want to get back to nuance that point a little bit. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to educate the public about Islam. It's just we need to be careful about understanding where that fits into the larger framework on countering Islamophobia. There's lots of ignorance about Islam and Muslims in the United States, right? That's not even really a point we have to debate here, I think. Frankly, there's just a lot of religious illiteracy, period, in the United States. It's not just about Islam. A lot of Americans even if they're religious, they don't know a whole lot about religion. They don't know a lot about the history of their own religious traditions, whether it's Islam or Christianity or others. So that is there, right? We have to name that. But I don't believe that ignorance is so much the primary driver or cause of Islamophobia as I believe it's to be a byproduct of Islamophobia, a byproduct particularly of the racism that is a main driver of Islamophobia. And when I say that Islamophobia is racism, one of the most common pushbacks I get, particularly if I'm speaking to, say, predominantly white and white Christian audiences, is like, oh, come on, Todd, Islam is not a race, or Muslims are not a race. I've lost count how many times I've heard that sort of retort, right? And yeah, I know, of course they're not. Muslims are not a race, but they are, as both Margari and Petra have said, that they are racialized, right? They are treated as a race. They're conceived of and imagined as this monolithic entity against which all sorts of things can be projected. This idea that Muslims possess some sort of inherent religious or cultural traits that ties them all together and therefore disqualifies them for full inclusion into the American cultural and religious landscape. And this is what I mean when I talk about Islamophobia as racism, this act of racializing. Now, my understanding, particularly to your question, Cassandra, of Islamophobia as racism, I mean, some of this comes from my background as a historian of religion. So there's historical research I point to, but it also comes just from experience in trying to counter Islamophobia. On the first point, historically, if we just take the United States, historically, religious communities in the United States that have fallen outside the spectrum of white Protestant Christianity, many such communities have been racialized historically at some point. And by that, I mean cast as non-white or not fully white, and therefore not fully a part of the United States, not fully American. This was true, just to take two examples, of Jews and Catholics in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. Both communities, strong immigrant backgrounds, both communities heavily racialized. You can find plenty of examples from the time period of politicians, journalists, civic leaders, Christian leaders framing these two communities as not white or not fully white. In the past, when I was as a professor, when I taught my course on American religious history, this is a time where I would show political cartoons from the 19th century, right? Framing and casting the Irish as not white. And my students are always a little confused, like, did they not ever look at the Irish? As if what were they thinking? But that's the larger point here, right? Whiteness is fluid. It's never been a static category. It gets expanded and it contracts and it gets deployed at certain moments in history when it's trying to target specific communities, to marginalize them, to cast them outside the pale of what it means to be American, to, in many ways, to take away any sort of civil liberties or political power that they might potentially have otherwise. And this is what happened to many Catholics in the 19th century, to Jews, particularly coming from Eastern Europe. This was not about skin color per se, right? Because whiteness is not just about skin color. It's a much more complex phenomenon. In time, of course, that changed. Catholics and Jews became to be seen more as white, and there's a whole body of scholarship on how the Irish became white and how Jews became white in American history, right? So there's this process that takes place. And all that's just to say that what has been deployed against Muslims all the way going back to slavery, right? And continuing into the 21st century is a long-standing phenomenon that has not been particular only to Muslims, but it's been there in other contexts as well. So that's that piece. Experientially, my understanding of Islamophobia as racism and my push for this stems from efforts of many people, scholars and faith leaders and whatnot, for decades to push back against Islamophobia by, again, focusing almost exclusively on Islam 101 talks and workshops. There's no shortage of Islam, introductory to Islam lectures for the public in the past couple of decades. And there's never been a time in which we've had so many good books and articles, op-ed pieces, internet resources on Islam than we have had in the recent years, the past couple of decades. We have more accessible, good information, scholarship, whatever about Islam than we've ever had out there, right? And yet, by most metrics, Islamophobia has been getting worse, not better, right? In many ways, Islamophobia has really moved into the mainstream in a way that's not subtle. Think of the 2015-16 presidential campaign. It's not just Donald Trump, it was Ted Cruz, it was, Ben Carson, right? And it wasn't subtle, it was very overt, very explicit. And this has all been happening as we have had all these efforts to educate the public about Islam, right? So what's going on here? We have to take a look at the policies that have been enshrined in our political system, from the Patriot Act to the Muslim ban, right? And keeping in mind that there's been a lot of policies embraced by both of the major parties. And the question becomes, how is all this possible in light of these efforts that we've made to educate the public about Islam? And I believe the reason for this lies in treating the problem primarily as one driven by ignorance, as opposed to something that's born out of white supremacy, born out of the racist systems and structures that are deeply embedded in our nation's political system. And the sooner we grasp this and begin to address Islamophobia within an anti-racism framework, the better chance we have of moving the needle, I think, in a significant way on Islamophobia. And final thing I'll just say about my own sort of how I changed my response. I don't give Islam 101 talks anymore. If I'm asked a question about Islam in a public setting, I will answer it as straightforwardly as I can, but I don't dwell on it. I don't give presentations on Islamic law or Sharia or jihad or anything like that. In fact, I believe a lot of those questions, they're either just based upon misunderstandings of what's going on here, or sometimes there's someone in the audience who's on the far right and they're bait questions, and I just don't go take the bait, right? I keep the focus at hand, because Islamophobia fundamentally is not about, if we just better understand what Muslims believe and how they practice their religion, we can now push back against Islamophobia. We're studying we're studying the impact of Islamophobia on Muslims, but Muslims are not the primary drivers of it, right? We're studying people like me. We're studying people who have my cultural, racial, religious background. And that's where I keep the focus, and I do it much more intensely today than I would have, say, 12 years ago or 15 years ago. And I don't take the bait and do these kind of tangents on Sharia. I can talk about Islamic law and the schools of Islamic law till I'm blue in the face. I have never experienced that making a difference from someone whose starting point is already apprehension or hostility towards Muslims. I've just never seen it work. And I've partnered with many Muslims who I think who've done this work over the years and have found something similar, right? It's just it's because that's not the source of the problem. We have to think about the racism piece of this much more explicitly.
Thanks so much, Todd. Thank you, all three of you. I want to open it up for any questions. I think this session is only supposed to be 45 minutes. So I want to make space for any questions. Then I also have some follow-up questions for us about examples on being a part of the solution. But I'd love to open up space for questions from the audience, either in the room or on Zoom.
Sandra, while we wait for that, I just want to emphasize Todd's last point. As someone who grew up post 9/11, I did not choose to do the work I'm doing today. It kind of landed on my plate. And even as a young, person, I was always asked about Islam and all these really, really hard concepts to explain. And my approach have shifted as well. So in the beginning, I spent so much time trying to figure out, how do I explain this to this person? How do I explain Sharia? And I didn't know myself, but I thought that was the answer too, until I came to the same conclusion that Todd came to, which is you can't do that anymore. And I think that's where the work that we do at ISPU is really important, because we moved the focus from the theology, which is still important. And for those who want to understand theology and history, there is a place for that, including Muslim Americans themselves, and focusing on the community itself as a group of people, as this is communities, not just one community. This is American Muslim communities with lots of diversity, a lot of challenges, a lot of things to offer to themselves and to their society. And that's how we're going to talk about it, including the challenges that they face, with Islamophobia being on the top of that. But definitely, I just want to emphasize, I don't answer questions on Sharia and jihad and women and whatever. It's like, you want to have that, buy me coffee and we could have a personal conversation, but we're not doing that on a lecture.
Yeah.
I also that also resonates with me in my experiences that just as you said, and there were a couple of other sessions during this conference that have talked about this as well, that it's not really a question of education. But that being said, Todd and everyone, what suggestions do you have for those of us when we're asked those questions, or when that sort of comes up in our context? What helpful responses can you give us?
I'll just briefly say, I remember one time this Lutheran minister reached out to me, someone I knew, asked a question like that. He was very specific. There's someone in his congregation who felt that we should be suspicious of Muslims, they should be under surveillance, et cetera, because they follow Sharia, right? And so this minister didn't know really much about Sharia, so he reached out to me and he wanted me to brief him on it. So brief me on Sharia so I can then turn around and I know what to say to this guy. And my initial response was, it's not going to help, right? But he was sort of stuck, right? And so finally I kind of was like, okay, I'll give in. Here's something you can say about Sharia, right? But my broader encouragement was to use that as a bridge into a much more pointed conversation about the history of white Christian supremacy, right? Which maybe this one individual is not going to sort of tolerate. I don't know, but that's the conversation Christian communities, and particularly white Christian communities, need to have. So much of Islamophobic tropes and stereotypes are projections onto Muslims about unresolved ethical, moral issues or historical issues that white Christian communities have not come to terms with. We are obsessed in the United States about something like jihad or terrorism that's perpetrated presumably by Muslims, I think in large part because we have not come to terms as white Christians, people like me have not come to terms with our own violent past and our ongoing complicity in the violent world order. And the role of the church, I think, can and should be helping their communities and congregations come to terms with that history, which in my experience, they know very, very little about. And certainly the students I've taught over the years in college come into my classroom knowing next to nothing about.
And that's obviously the case here as well. Even our own Omaha has an enormous amount of just horrific history regarding race, the things that the white community has done across the board, from violent deaths to redlining to things that continue, to this day, and no one knows about it and it's not talked about. It's just taboo, and we close our eyes to it.
Yeah, what I think, because I do a lot of multi-faith organizing, so we work with people of faith to work towards justice and organizing campaigns, and one of the ways that we educate each other, like when we're doing, whether it's like a research group or talking, is like we try to get to the root behind things. And so it's sort of like who's benefiting from these narratives, right? Who's benefiting from dehumanizing people of different faiths, right? And so when you think about like just the industry, right? Like, I mean, we have the AR-15s. What are they fighting for? Many of them, it's a similar thing, like these wild conspiracy theories, and it's kind of overlaid, right, with anti-Muslim things, with globalism, like where we're focusing on like how small our world is, like they don't want this, this kind of pluralistic world, but really who's benefiting is not the everyday person that's maybe buying these things or even enlisting, right? Like there were people after 9/11, like they enlisted right away, and we're dealing with the fallout of all these people with PTSD from their service. And so it's really the military complex. It's trillions of dollars driving us into debt. And I think when we get to that, it's like this investment in weapons and military equipment to occupy, and now like from a distance using, like artificial, not even artificial, like you have people like drones going in and like they make so much money off of that. And as long as they can manufacture the continual threat, especially the threat of like ambiguous people who can like maybe assimilate in some ways and, infiltrate, like as long as they keep those narratives, you have people that are demagogues that are, running into like getting into office. So that's why we had the Muslim ban. It was very popular, right? I mean, you have like the militarism I mean, and you could see that in so much of like in our media also, which is like very guilty of Islamophobic tropes and just kind of continuing that. And we could find the connection because directly, if you're going to have a military movie, you can't even have like they were saying that they have to get like if they want to even sample the sound of a helicopter, the military has to approve the script. So if you wanted to have like an anti-war, like a real deep one that actually would shift popular consciousness, it probably would not get approved. And there's so many scripts, like just things that just get cut where there's a relationship between certain industries and the military. And I'm not saying that, hey, that's all, but I do think as people of faith, like, I mean, this really goes against like our values as far as like the hyper militarism, while we have people that are hungry and poor. So, and there's also like, and Maythel Hassan has a really great study that actually focused not just on Arabs, but on the depiction of Muslims, and Pillars Foundation has done great work. And there's a direct correlation between the kind of media narratives of public officials, of the news, how it depicts people, and motion pictures and TV shows, and how that can allow people to say, hey, I want my freedom to have whatever, automatic weapons, but I'm totally fine with preventing any Muslims from having anything to protect themselves or to be even involved. Like they want to keep Muslims out of civic engagement and running for office. So you could just see that kind of, it's always okay for the other person, and that jeopardizes all of our freedom. And I think that's what we have to really focus on, is like the cost of these narratives of Islamophobia. It's costing every American so much money when we could be making our society better and our world better and more safe by, first like building bridges and having better policies towards like whether it's aid, cooperation, and funding mental health programs in schools, and allowing our schools to be able to teach world religions, where you're seeing in states, and I'm not sure, like I have to check what's happening in Nebraska, but there's people that don't, like, they will take every reference to religion because they don't want their children to understand who Muslims are, that we're human beings and we have the same aspirations as anybody else. So they'll pull it all out of their curriculum. It's all part of that anti-CRT scare. It's directly tied to that. And it should be our commitment to teach our children the truth, right? To teach our children to understand people who are different from us, so that we could prepare for a more pluralistic world.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we do have to wrap up because I'm facilitating another session in another building at 3:30. So
okay, great. I'm just going to give a final closing thought. Shoulder to shoulder, we have developed the toolkit that Petra already put in the chat, countering Islamophobia. And in part of that work, what we talk about is also the value, the power of leaders and individuals, that when we talk about changing our country, we think about the most extreme person that we want to change. I want to change Donald Trump. I want to change Steve Bannon. Well, those people are probably not going to listen to me. I'm a vegetarian who plays guitar, does yoga, and like has weird curly hair. And so like they're not, that's not who my greatest impact is going to be. And so what we talk about is the greatest impact are the people directly around us, and also incremental change. And incremental change for this, thank you. The incremental change on the personal level, the political, social level, we can do policy advocacy and there should be faster change. But when we're talking about incremental personal changes, people don't vote by logic, they vote by emotions. And so when we talk about countering Islamophobia, we talk about meeting the emotion, not the myth. So to hear people's fears and to acknowledge that fear, and then to say, what else are you afraid of? I'm afraid too, of our kids in schools and these lockdown drills. That's really terrifying to me. And so to have a real conversation with people, and then to bring into that real conversation, my experience with Muslims has been a little different than that. I've actually had these, like, can you insert your real life experiences? And that has actually been shown to actually change people's minds for the long term. And so that is a really simple way to have a conversation and to change people's minds when you hear that Islamophobia, when you hear those comments, when there's no Muslims around or no one who you think is Muslim, because there might be, and you may not know. And so it's also about human dignity and recognizing each other's human dignity and our rights to live in this country. And so thank you, everybody, for your joining us virtually and in person. I know that we are all available if you want to reach out to us by our websites and organizations, and we would love to connect with you again.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.